מאז אותו יום שחור אנחנו נלחמים. זוהי מלחמת הקיום שלנו. מלחמת התקומה. כך אני מבקש לקרוא למלחמה באופן רשמי. מאז אותו יום שחור אנחנו בהתקפה בשבע חזיתות. התקפת הנגד שלנו על אויבינו בציר הרשע של איראן היא תנאי הכרחי להבטחת עתידנו, להבטחת ביטחוננו. אנחנו נסיים את המלחמה כשנשלים את כל היעדים שקבענו. מיטוט שלטון הרשע של החמאס, החזרת כל חטופינו הביתה, החללים והחיים כאחד, סיכול של כל איום עתידי מעזה על ישראל, והשבת תושבינו בדרום ובצפון בבטחה לבתיהם.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's the message from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He says that Israel is fighting a war of resurrection to ensure that October 7th never happens again. A year after the deadly war began. Meanwhile, President Biden says, and I quote, far too many civilians have suffered. Now, it's the same time last year when, in a surprise attack on Israel, Hamas killed more than 1,000 people and took over 250 people as hostages to Gaza, triggering a war that's just been raging. And Israel started bombing Gaza shortly after. And that war has now become a multi-frontal war involving Lebanon, Hezbollah, Yemen, Gaza, Houthis, Iran, amongst others. More than 1,400 Israelis have lost their lives. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Gaza lies entirely in ruin. So the big question is, where does this war end now? Is an end to the war in sight? To discuss those and more details, I'm now joined by Kabir Taneja, the Deputy Director of Strategic Studies and Middle East Fellow ORF, and Professor Stephen Zunes, the Director of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco. Let me come to you, Kabir, first. Now, Netanyahu says that it is waging a war of resurrection and won't stop until Israel's objectives are met. So where does this war end now? Because like I mentioned, the human cost has been the steepest in this war. Israel says that negotiations can only start if a beginning to the return of hostages can begin. But where does this all end?
Look, I think there's no easy answer to that. I think from an Israeli perspective, they are fighting an existential war, which was started by Hamas last year in October. You know, when a conflict is started by one side, the response is usually decided by the side that's responding. And hence we have seen the mass sort of civilian casualties both in Gaza and in Lebanon as well. But what Israel's aim is, from what I can read, is that they want to decimate both Hezbollah and Hamas to a point where they cannot have a resurgence. So basically that their borders with Gaza and their borders with Lebanon are free from these two terror groups. Now, I think they're very close to that militarily. The bigger question right now is politically, what is the future looking like? And politically, what kind of longevity will these military gains have, let's say 4 years or 5 years down the line, when a political solution is required, both either in Gaza or even in southern Lebanon from the Lebanese side against Hezbollah. That's the bigger question here. On the tactical side, I think you know, the Israelis have had a very clear aim, specifically after October 7th last year, that they want to degrade and diminish Hezbollah and Hamas as much as possible. And I think militarily they are reaching there, or they're very close to it. But the long term is still a very open-ended question with very difficult answers to predict.
Yes, Kabir, let me take in comments from Professor as well. Professor, now Kabir states, Kabir agrees with what Netanyahu says, that it is a war of a resurrection. But would you really agree with that? Because, you know, the other side says that Netanyahu has expansionist tendencies and it's only expanding.
Yeah, the war did not start on October 7th. The war has been going back 75 years, the mass dispossession of Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing, which led to this crowded enclave of Gaza. The vast majority of people in Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees. The failure of the far-right Israeli government to allow for a Palestinian mini-state on the West Bank in Gaza, which the Palestine Authority, the recognized government of Palestine in Ramallah has led to the rise of extremist groups like Hamas. I mean, Hamas only had a tiny percentage of support of the Palestinians and at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords, but the Israelis have been violating the Oslo Accords by continuing to colonize the West Bank and oppress people. And indeed, the reason that Hamas was able to launch its terrible terrorist attack 1 year ago was that Netanyahu had taken several divisions of Israeli troops out of Israel that should have been guarding the border, including the Gaza Brigade, and sent them to the West Bank to help repress the Palestinians in the occupied territories. If Israeli troops had simply been in Israel guarding the borders, this attack would have never happened. Now, no matter how oppressed people have been, even if they are under a foreign belligerent occupation or a siege like Gaza, it never gives anybody the right to attack civilians. I mean, this was a heinous act of terrorism that could never be justified. But remember, the Israelis,
Absolutely.
have ended up killing, over 30
Right.
times more civilians, and that's an act of terror as well.
Right, Professor, and we'll come to that point. Let me interject here and bring in Kabir. Now, Kabir, let's also go to, what Netanyahu has said, besides, of course, a statement that I mentioned earlier. He's gone on to say that the October 7th attack was the most horrific attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust happened. Is there fear-mongering? Is that fear-mongering on part of Benjamin Netanyahu, or is that an actual threat? Now, why I ask this is also because Netanyahu has defied all odds and he's remained in power. He's not been ousted. More than that, he's also convinced his main political rival, Benny Gantz, to join the emergency government and war cabinet.
I mean, look, from Netanyahu's perspective, considering this war has been happening, I mean, this particular side of the war, I agree with the professor earlier that this has been happening for a long period of time. It's not new. This is a symptom of a situation that's been prevailing for decades. But Netanyahu was fairly an embattled prime minister for a long period of time prior to this. Even after October 7th, his handling of the situation was not seen as great. You have to remember that there are still over 100 Israeli citizens supposed to be under the captivity of Hamas, and we are not hearing anything about what kind of talks can be placed on the table for the release of those captives. Which I find a little strange, considering how much emphasis is being given on degradation of both Hamas and Hezbollah. And as I said before, right, that's a military aim. The militarily, yes, they have been sort of pushed back. That's fairly clear. We saw that with the assassination of both Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah. But the larger political question is still wide open. But over the past at least month and a half, Netanyahu's polls within Israel have also gone up after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah. So
Kabir, you don't agree. Kabir, do you agree or do you not agree that? Do you agree or do you not agree to the fact that Netanyahu might be using this war for political gains?
I mean, sure. I mean, why wouldn't he use it for his own political gains right now, considering how embattled he was? But the war was basically sort of, came to him. It's something that, if you remember, even prior to October 7th, there were mass protests in Israel against Netanyahu's government, including judicial processes where even reservists from the Israeli military had participated. So yes, definitely he's using this current war for his personal benefit as well. I mean, that's glaringly clear.
Professor, let me come to you and let me understand from you, what has that October 7th attack really achieved for Hamas, Israel, and its proxies?
Well, for years now, the repression and colonization of the West Bank had been increasing. The moderate overtures of the Palestine Authority have been rejected by Israel, and Hamas warned if this had continued, they would attack. Just a few weeks before the attack, Netanyahu said that we can ignore the Palestinians. After all, the the United States is blocking the United Nations from enforcing its resolutions for a two-state solution and end to the occupation and colonization. The U.S. refused to condition military aid to anything that they might do. So he said, hey, we can just ignore the Palestinians. And what October 7th was a desperate plea. Oh, no, you cannot, ignore us anymore. And of course, a horrible way to do it. I mean, the victims of this, ironically, the primary Israeli civilian victims were members of the kibbutzim and attenders at this rock concert, both of whom demographics who tend to be very left-wing and oppose Netanyahu, oppose the occupation. And again, nothing can justify the horror of October 7th, but indeed, it was a failure to reward the moderates, to go to compromise, which led
Right.
to this kind of extremism.
Right. Right. Kabir, let me come to you now. Of course, there are talks of an escalation, that an escalation could perhaps happen from the Israeli side. We've seen, attacks on Beirut as well. But on a larger attack on Iran's oil facilities, is that a realistic risk? And if that is, then what is Iran likely to do if there is strike back by Israel? Speak to us about the magnitude of that kind of an action happening.
Look, I think that's a good question, but that's happened in the past. In the first Gulf War, when oil facilities were targeted, they were set alight in Iraq, all across Iraq. So it's a strategy that has been employed previously. So I mean, you would not put it off the table, considering how critical oil is to Iran. Iran is a heavily sanctioned state. Its economy is in turmoil, and the only country that is really buying oil from Iran right now in hordes, but that means that is paying Iran in large sums of money also, is China. So China is the only real buyer of Iranian oil. Now, if such an attack is conducted against Iran, first and foremost, their traditional military is not very well equipped. It has very old equipment, including American planes from the 70s, which is why they use so much of their forward strategy using militias as an alternative. And the second thing is that if that oil money that comes from China right now stops, that would be a very, very critical exchequer crisis for Iran. So on the cusp of it, it would be a huge sort of challenge for Iran, both to inculcate and try to repel, because their capacities are fairly limited.
Absolutely. It's going to be a challenge for all parties involved. Kabir, let me go across to Professor. Professor, at this point, we're getting in some comments by Trump. He says that Netanyahu is not listening at all to Biden. That they don't even speak. Let me get in your first reactions to these kind of comments, and then I'll bring in more questions related to how this war is also becoming fodder for election campaigning.
Well, Trump has always used this line that somehow the Democrats are weak, and if he was president, we wouldn't have any wars because everybody would fear and respect the United States. He even claims Russia would not have invaded Ukraine and Hamas would have never attacked Israel. That's nonsense, of course. The impetus for Hamas and Russia's actions are totally on their own, regardless of who's president of the United States. The bigger threat, I think, to the election of Harris is that the majority of Americans, and including a very large majority of Democratic-leaning voters, while broadly supportive of Israel, very much oppose the blank check that Biden has given in terms of insisting that military aid be unconditional, his vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions and the like, and that a lot of left-wing voters, Muslim voters, Arab American voters, young voters who would normally vote Democratic are saying, no, we're not going to support a member of an administration that has been aiding and abetting war crimes.
Because we're completely running out of time. I would have to disagree. I disagree with you a little bit when you say that, Trump says that, had he been there, the war would not have happened, because Trump just yesterday said that Israel should hit Iran's nuclear sites. And that is warmongering. And that is definitely politicking over the dead, over the displaced. I want to ask from you, is the upcoming election then doing more harm than good? Especially, I'm talking about the US presidential elections.
I mean, there's some people who speculate, and indeed some people in Washington have been speculating that that Netanyahu has rejected the U.S. ceasefire proposals that Hamas has largely supported and expanded the war to Lebanon, Yemen, and possibly even Iran, because the longer the war goes on, the more expanded it is, the more civilians get killed, the more it hurts the prospects of Kamala Harris winning and more likely electing Trump, whom Netanyahu clearly favors.
Right, Kabir, we have time for one more question, and let me take it across to you now. Hezbollah is continuing to be struck by Israeli air raids and airstrikes, but at the same time, Israel also continues to face this multi-sided attack. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu says that Israel will win, but what are the challenges that you foresee for Israel? We have very limited time, so if you could please be quick on that.
Look, the challenge for Israel right now, in my head, militarily, they will do fine. But politically, long term, I don't think there is any clear blueprint that they have presented on what kind of, let's say, what kind of Gaza would they want to see after Hamas is defeated? Who is going to take over? What kind of, are they okay with the PLO to come in, which they haven't been in the past? In fact, they've supported at times even anti-PLO activities within Gaza. So I think that the lack of political clarity is going to be a critical point that Israel really needs to fill in. Militarily, I think they'll be doing fine. But what after that is the question they really need to start working on now.
Right. All right. On that note, Kabir, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Professor, as well, for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts on this war that's just been escalating. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now shift our focus from that story to the other big story that we're tracking, and that is on the state visit of Maldivian President Mohamed Moizu, who is here till the 10th of October. In fact, earlier in the day, he met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, sounding optimistic about the relations between the two nations. He shared how he hopes for more Indians to tour the Maldives, which is a stark U-turn from his previous stance. Remember, ties between India and Maldives came under severe strain since Moizu, who's known for his pro-China leanings, in fact, took charge of the top office in November. The two leaders today signed many agreements. We'll, of course, decode the outcome of this visit at 9 p.m. On Business at 9. But for now, it's goodbye from all of us here on India Tonight. Hope you like the show as much as we did putting it together for you.